Let's talk to Brendan O'Neill, who's editor of Spiked Online. I hope you're approving of Tom this morning, Brendan. But you've written a really interesting article about and a number of interesting articles during this about the lockdown and how long it lasts. And it is fascinating, isn't it, how much the lockdown seems to have the full approval of almost everyone on the left and the trade unions and very much not the approval of businesses. There does seem to be almost a left-right struggle now about how quickly we ease the lockdown. What do you put that down to?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and the left is now definitely the most pro-lockdown wing of the political class, and I think that's really interesting. It's like I feel that the left has lost the plot. I mean, everyone agreed that there needed to be certain measures in relation to COVID-19. Some of us argued for mild measures, others argued for stricter measures. But the left has become passionately pro-lockdown. They don't think at all about the economic consequences, the fact that 2 million people in the UK could lose their jobs, hundreds of millions of people around the world are at risk of losing their livelihoods as a result of the lockdown contagion, because lockdown has spread around the world as well. They don't think about these factors. The fact that lockdown hits the least well off the hardest, because these are the people who have to leave their houses in order to make a living, and who many of whom want to go back to making a living and are worried that their jobs won't exist at the end of the furlough scheme. So the left has turned against working people in a way that I find really perverse.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, of course, with the public sector unions, and we see very, very little unionisation in the private sector, and many unions would say, well, that's one of the problems why the conditions aren't so good. But teachers can say we're not going to go back to work and be furloughed. And again, a lot of teachers are doing a brilliant job, and they are providing those online lessons. An awful lot of teachers who aren't providing those online lessons. I know an awful lot of people whose kids aren't getting anything more than a printed out worksheet once a week, and that is simply not good enough and unexcusable. There's no economic, financial reason for that, depending on which state school your kid's at. But there's an element where they know their jobs are safe. They won't be closing the schools at the end of this. Whereas the private sector, they know those jobs aren't necessarily safe. We've seen in America, haven't we, these shocking statistics about the number of Americans who are jobless, up 3 million just last week. That's 1 in 4 US workers. That's 36 million US workers now on jobless benefits. Realistically, we've got 1 in 4 people on furlough schemes. We could, if we didn't have the furlough scheme, or if and when it ends, see similar sort of proportions of people possibly out of work, but not in the public sector. Do you think that's where the divide has been?
I think that's a really important divide. And I think in relation to the furlough scheme, for some private sector workers in particular, I think this is a form of suspended unemployment, to be brutally honest, because some of these businesses, especially small businesses, are not going to survive this process. So people are getting paid now, but I'm not sure that's going to last beyond August or beyond October. I think, in relation to the teaching unions in particular, I have to be honest, I think they're behaving terribly. I think they are abandoning the nation's children on the basis of a ramped up culture of fear that doesn't reflect the reality, which is that most experts now think that schools are not going to be hotbeds of infection, and that children very, very rarely pass the disease on to adults. So they're using fear to justify not going back to work, and that's having a devastating impact on the nation, particularly, once again, on less well-off people who don't necessarily have the time or the space to do homeschooling, and who can't go to work even if they're allowed to, because they have to look after their children. So the knock-on impact of what the teaching unions are doing on both children's development and on the economic standing of certain sections of society, I think is unforgivable. They really need to get a grip.
Well, Lord Blunkett basically said, these are the same people who be outside their homes, enthusiastic clapping for carers and those who are out working at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, as we were out last night. Though I have to say, really noticeable in my street how many fewer people there were out there. And I wonder if a lot of that is down to the fact that people are coming out of lockdown. But actually, if you're clapping for carers, saying, isn't it great these people are being heroes, but you're not prepared to do it yourself. Now, lots of people have said to me on social media and elsewhere, well, you're not out of your home. I'd be back at at work if I was allowed to. I think they're using the pandemic as an excuse to keep me at home, if you ask me. But there's a lot of the commentariat, a lot of the Twitterati. They're sitting at home with their laptops, sitting in their lovely spare rooms, showing their bookshelves off on Sky News and the BBC, like as I'm sure your good self has done many times, thinking that, well, they're all fine. But actually, the knock-on effect of this lockdown in terms of people not being out and about, people not working, not having the money to buy things, people, therefore, companies not paying for advertising. Well, an awful lot of the jobs that those commentariat do, they're not going to exist in a few months' time either.
I know, it's ridiculous. It's so self-destructive. It's so stupid. The thing I really dislike about the left's love for the lockdown is the idea that they are helping to protect working class people. So you have these usually quite middle class leftists in their apartments, still doing their work, still doing their TV stuff, still writing their columns, and saying, we must save the working classes from going outside of their houses. We must prevent them from getting on the tube. It's so Victorian and paternalistic and so hypocritical. They're still getting their Deliveroo food. They're still going to the supermarkets. They're still doing things that require other people to work in order for them to do it. I just think there's an element where I think the reason the left loves the lockdown is there's a sense where they've got us just where they want us. They've become very nanny statish in recent years. They've become quite anti-people, quite cut off from ordinary people. They don't trust us very much, as we saw during the Brexit process. I think they like the idea of ordinary people being at home and needing the assistance of the state, and they don't want anything to tear that apart. So I think there's a real nannying instinct behind the less love of the lockdown, and I would argue that working people who want to go back out should be allowed to go back out.